I am sure that everybody that's been involved with charismatic types of ministries have seen some kind of a checklist, an intake form, so to speak, where the counselee is going to go through a list of, I guess I would call them hindrances, and pick out those particular ones that are particularly hindering to them. This is turned over to the counselor, and the counselor is able then to get some background on perhaps some of the forces that are hindering the person. I think most people that have been involved in this read the ancient book, Pigs in the Parlor, where there's list after list after list of things. But as I go through those lists, one thing that strikes me is that if I were to check some of these things, how shameful I would be to turn over to somebody else, especially if I had been forgiven of it. I would tend not to check those particular things. So I took a different tack on this whole setup of a checklist, trying to keep the categories of hindrances pretty general. Pretty general. Well, you'll see what I mean. And I use a different format entirely that I think helps us to maybe consider things that aren't on the list and put them on as we go through. And here's the beginning of the list. You can see it's fairly long. Try to go through them quickly. You've got a column here, you and others. Outside you, outside others. Inside you, inside others, etc. And you or a person can go through this list and click if you have been subject to this particular resistance. One thing that's missing from other lists is, what about the significant others? Friends, relatives, neighbors, acquaintances, enemies. Do you remember the Fran plan? Friends, relatives, acquaintances, neighbors, enemies. We use that when we're doing evangelism. But this is another way you can use this as well, because if you have, say, a sociopath that you're connected with in some way, that's going to affect you more than really if you had considered yourself to be on a borderline there. Or if you're living with somebody with, say, borderline disorder, that's going to have an effect on your chart in the spiritual world, because that's something that demons can attach to very easily, and they're going to be bugging you all the time if you're close to them. So you can see that these are very general. I start with anxiety or panic. I guess I should have said first that some people have professional diagnosis for these particular disorders. I would say a lot of people have and probably don't know it unless you've actually gone in and asked a mental health professional to give you one of the many surveys for such a thing. And the surveys that you'll normally get, they vary, but they're usually quite long. And they're usually surveys that will take you a couple of hours easy. And you only get yes or no answers on them. There's no middle ground. It's either yes or no. And built within these assessments are, well, I guess you'd call them trick questions, whereas you're going to find one question that contradicts another that you've done earlier, and that's done purposefully. Yet online, there are a number of psychological websites where they have whole batteries of self-tests. I've got some links to them, but they're easy enough to find. If you just put in your search engine something like mental disorders checklist or mental disorders survey or assessment, you'll find them. There's a couple of these to beware of, though. One in particular is put out by Scientology, and they don't say who they are until you get to the end of the survey, and after you've done all the work to get that done, they don't give you the answers. They set you up an appointment with one of their counselors, and that's the only way you can get the assessment, even if they are even valid. I did this myself, so I know. And with your email address, they'll bug you to come into wherever the nearest city with occult headquarters is to sit down and get on the e-meter and get your assessment. Anxiety or panic, you or a counselee would check under one of these columns. This should probably be put on a spreadsheet. Bipolar disorder, that they used to call manic depressive disorder, where a person appears to be very low energy, very depressed, antisocial for a particular time, usually somewhere around a week, 10 days, up until maybe 3 weeks. And then we'll go on the exact opposite kind of course. Manic, full of energy, full of great ideas, usually very entertaining too. It's very hard to deal with as a partner to somebody with a bipolar disorder because you never know when the moods are going to change. And there isn't much medication that will help this. But this and all these other mental disorders that we're going to see, they need to be dichotomized from demonic infiltrations. You're going to have to know that somebody with bipolar has probably a 99% chance of having some kind of infestation. We don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but we have to remember that we have to keep disorders separate from infiltration because they are usually sprout from different causes, whereas mental disorders can be a matter of brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, or some type of trauma. Demonic infiltration comes from a different source, a spiritual source. One can attach to the other, or the other can attach to the first. We talked a little bit about dissociative personality disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder. And again, this is a case where a counselor has to be able to discern the difference between an alter personality and a demonic infiltration. And then has to keep in mind that the alters need to eventually be brought together, be united as one. And the demons that are attached to such have to be driven out as well. Seasonal affective disorder, that's when you get around holidays and you get so depressed. Maybe some folks that are Hebrews now, when it comes Christmas time or Easter time, they think about all the wonderful family times they had in the past before they converted and go into a seasonal depression about it. Seasonal affective disorder. Eating problems, binging, bulimia, schizophrenia. They have a much more focused definition of that these days. This is a problem with the brain where the two lobes of the brain are not working in tandem. Some of the symptoms of this include breaks from reality, talking to oneself or talking to unseen others, and sometimes violence. I have a couple of sheets. Why don't I just put them up here that are from the internet that I thought were pretty good. Notes on some of the symptoms of mental disorders and some of the causes of mental disorders insofar as psychiatry can tell you. I'm hoping that the stigma of mental disorders will be diminished in the future, because it seems to me that an awful large percentage of the population are affected by one or the other to some degree. And if you get to know the definitions and the symptoms, you have a very good chance to be able to put your finger on those disorders with the people you work with or even yourself. I know one that I didn't include on this list, Asperger's syndrome, seems to be a quite larger group than it has been in the past. It had been associated with a type of schizophrenia, but now it's associated with autism and obsessive compulsive disorder. So I'll just add that here. Trauma, head trauma especially, can lead to all types of mental disorders, as can numerous emotional issues. Betrayal is one that I talked about with someone else this week. Every one of us has undoubtedly been the victim of betrayal, which is a type of trauma. It's like getting hit with a baseball bat when you find someone close to you has betrayed your trust in one way or the other. And I can't think of anybody, including Yeshua himself, that hasn't been a victim of that type of trauma, spiritual, physical, or mental trauma. Substance abuse, a very general category. We don't really need to know if they're addicted to heroin or coffee. And I was looking at a new category here today, that is addiction to serotonin reuptake inhibitors and different kinds of medicine for depression. Some of those are extremely addictive. And to get off of those, cold turkey, for instance, causes an incredible amount of, I would say, mental confusion and physical things, such as feeling like you're electrified, Visions and dreams, especially dreams, when one does not, it's not able to take their SSRI or Mayo inhibitor for one reason or the other. Substance abuse, whatever it happens to be. I think that one should be under that is sugar abuse. Birth defect, hey, we all have them. I have one that I just learned of just maybe a decade ago. I don't have something that other people have, just about all. And it's obvious if you look closely. And you would say, if I told you what it was, you'd say, oh, that's nothing serious. You're right, it's nothing serious. But it's still considered a birth defect. What normalcy is, I don't know really. Cyclothymia, I think that's another word for mood swings, especially swings that happen on the spur of the moment. Hallucinations, delusions, drug induced, brain chemical induced, trauma induced, betrayal induced, social anxiety. That's one I have. They say that for most people, a great majority of people, the most difficult or the scariest thing that they can ever do is public speaking. Some would rather face physical pain than trying to get up in front of a group. Or social anxiety also finds itself in the form of schizotypal disorder, which you might consider people that are hermits or hoarders, people with one-track minds that simply, like Asperger's syndrome, are not social people, but they lock themselves in places for long periods of time. Schizotypal. Pyromania, kleptomania, impulse control disorders, buying things. Another impulse control disorder I read about here recently was buying things cheap. Impulse control on bargains. Maybe I told you, but my grandfather had this, something like this. When he saw a bargain, he had to buy it. One time he saw a bargain at a department store, and he came home with boxes after boxes of size double and triple D brasiers. Boxes of them, which he had shipped to Haiti. And in Haiti, the boxes of those that sat in storage for who knows how long were stolen. Until one day, what happened to them came to the fore, as we saw in a couple of villages, brasiers hanging from the trees everywhere, double and triple D brasiers. So this type of impulse control, I call it depression mentality or cheapskate disorder. It can be just as controlling as impulsive buying, impulsive gambling, etc. And another thing I found out that is very important to this, when we are anticipating something good happening to us, especially if it's a long anticipation, and we almost get to living in an alternative world because we're in such expectation of certain things, that the pleasure center in the brain receives the enkephalins and endorphins to control pain until that which is desired actually is received. Then it all goes away. In fact, when something is received that is it's your an expectation of, your brain inhibitors take a great dip. I don't know about you, but maybe if you have ever expected something and when you got it, you said something like, well, it isn't what I thought it was going to be. We expect the big thrill to be in receiving, but that's when the endorphins stop upon the receiving. I thought that was very interesting. Gives us an idea why, at least in a physiological sense, that we feel disappointed. Antisocial, antisocial disorder also can be severe, where antisocial people take a violent agenda. And today, antisocial people with a violent agenda are coming out of the woodwork. Take this man that kidnapped was it a 13-year-old recently, killed the parents, took off with the girl. She was recovered. But this fellow was a hermit, never came out except to go to work, never was able to socialize. And the thing that is coveted is what parades before the eyes. If it parades before the eyes long enough and it's desirous enough, for some people, it's impossible to control those disorders, even with all the willpower in the world. And of course, what can we say that is fueling such things other than some type of evil, unclean entity? Paranoia. I think that antisocial disorder, schizophrenia, schizotypal disorder are all types of paranoia. Paranoia, of course, is anxiety towards things real or imagined that may happen to you, maybe have happened in the past. I added one to that, and that's pronoid. It's just the opposite of paranoid. You're expecting good things to come to pass, and therefore, in the course of the expectation, again, you're pumping chemicals into your brain, things you really can't control, that please the pleasure centers of your brain. Pronoia, post-traumatic stress syndrome. My friend was kidnapped by low-class terrorists, held for ransom, shot several times. And he was kept in a small garage with an inch of water in it, full of mosquitoes, in an area of a third world country, whereas the drums were pounding at all hours of the day and night. And there he was for 3 days before he was able, as a bloody near martyr, to escape. And a couple years later, I took him to Hebrew Root Service, where there were conga drums going. He couldn't take it. He ran out of the place. Took me hours to find him. Triggers. Factitious. I'm not sure what that means anymore. Do you? Factitious. Gender disorders, identity, paraphilia. If somebody has a gender disorder, you don't need to know what it is. Because if you're successful in the inner healing process and go on to the deliverance or restoration process, chances are you're going to find out what that is, because you're going to want to make contact with it. Because very often, such things as these are large, occult, and powerful demons. Oftentimes they have names as well. Or titles. They take on the persona of the person. You've got to really work on the inner healing process to soften them up before we get to working on them. Or else, especially for those that, like us, that have very limited experience, we're going to come against a brick wall there. Somatic disorders, that is pain without reasonable reason, without source. Moving pains, pains that go from place to place in the body, or outbreaks of rashes that move around, or muscle or joint soreness that moves around. Somatic disorders. Tics and trembling. Like, I think Guillain-Barre syndrome would be fitting into this. In fact, that's tics and trembling are a couple of the things that some of the books we have read considered to be indications that a person not only had some physical neurological disorder, but also some infiltration. Alzheimer's, dementia. I did a project when I was an undergraduate on the genetic implications of Alzheimer's disease. Would you believe that Alzheimer's disease and what do they call it? They used to call them mongoloid children. I can't think of it right now. Lifespan about 30.
Down syndrome.
Down syndrome. Thank you. They're both on the fifth gene pair. They're very closely related in that way, but they express themselves in very different ways. And I am one that believes that Alzheimer's disease is genetically passed down. I think that's the main cause of it, from genetic curses. And as you know, this causes amyloid protein in your system to go wild and collect in the brain, and causes nerves to die, synapses to die, and all kinds of problems from that. But the last of my research on this said that there were 3 ways that you diagnose Alzheimer's that make it different than other dementias. Else the only way you can diagnose it, unless there's been some new development, is by autopsy. But the 3 are aphasia, apraxia, and amnesia. If a person 50 or above, sometimes earlier for early onset familial Alzheimer's, has those 3 characteristics: aphasia, inability to talk clearly; apraxia, inability to move with agility; and amnesia, inability to remember, especially the short-term memory. You could be pretty certain that you're dealing with Alzheimer's instead of some other type of dementia. It's interesting that this word dementia is even used today, because oftentimes that's exactly what it is. Low energy, confusion. There is a family of demonic entities I think you could call confusion. I don't know if you've experienced this, but for some people, when they come into the room, it's like a sheet falls over a believer's head. A spirit of confusion comes in. It seems like those that are confused are also very outgoing as well, and either don't inhibit this characteristic or enjoy inhibiting it for the general public, anyone they're around. Spirit of confusion. And of course, we go on to demonic infiltration or possession. Those are some of the major mental illnesses. You might surprise yourself if you go on some of these self-help assessments. You may surprise yourself more if you go into a mental health office and ask to take an assessment there for mental health. It'll cost you some money. It cost me $300. The reason I spent that money was because I was writing assessments myself for other people. At one time, through the course of 12 years, I did personality, motivational gifts, temperament assessments for over 1,000 people online, free of charge. And I never got around to writing the program that would do it automatically. I did it all by hand. Took a lot of time. But I got a lot of data on these things too that gave me so much insight into not only assessments themselves, but personality. And it got to the point where if you use an assessment like that, but you add to it the wisdom of the Holy Spirit, invoke the Holy Spirit into the process of assessing, you have an opportunity to come up with helpful suggestions to the people who would do these assessments that are more than helpful. They're prophetic. Over the course of that time, I got to talk to lots of people about their personality styles and temperaments. And some of them would share the root causes of those, well, I'd say aberrations in some cases. You think you've heard everything. How about outside of you? Others hate you, or you hate yourself? I think we all go through this at one time or the other, but for some, it's a lifestyle. Curse, spell victim, feeling bad all the time. We don't need to wonder if witches still are around or not. They certainly are. And if they're practicing witch, there's no such thing as white or black witchcraft. They're both the same. Practicing roots, Santa Maria, any of these native religions. The purpose behind such religions, is to appropriate spiritual entities for to attain the desires of the flesh. Voodoo is one that I've studied closely and done a couple of papers on that in regards to the zombie. I mean, the real zombie. And the reason for voodoo ceremonies. When I was 20 years old, I got lost in Port-au-Prince in the middle of the night and walked into voodoo ceremonies. And I found out it was for the sake of people appropriating demons. And to do this, they would use rum specifically, but also they would drink blood and eat raw meat or bite the head of a chicken right off the chicken. These kind of outrageous things in order to appropriate. And even today, you've got the Catholic Church in places like Haiti and some places in Africa that have completely syncretized with the native religions, which is what voodoo is. It's a syncretism. For each of the saints, we have a voodoo loa. They're called loas, like Eloah, loas. For instance, they've got one called Lord Sabaoth, who is a Jesus character in a black robe and a cigar in his mouth. And they call on occult spirits like that to come in and help them to gain power over other people. So we get right back to the curse again, to gain power over other people. Feeling bad all the time? We might look into that. In fact, if we do any actual praxis, this is something that we might want to do immediately, because I have no doubt that I have been cursed in more than once. Insulting outside of you, inside of you. Victimization. I think it's like the Me Too movement. I was also a victim. So you can't blame the victim, a concept that was really strong in the 80s and 90s. Not to blame the victim. Sometimes the victim needs to be blamed. And that's our duty to discern whether that's the case or not. Secret societies, we talked about that a little before. No need to go into the Masonic order anymore, but there are many more than that. I had a couple of, I've got to work from my own personal experiences. You see, I went into a new church in Alabama at one time as the pastor. And it wasn't long before the one of the heads of the board had me over to their house. And they showed me, here's a man and his wife. The man showed me this ancient Masonic Bible he said his grandfather had. And he insisted that I take this Bible up to the podium of the church and use it for preaching. I couldn't do that. I said, I'm sorry. I tried to be polite, but it got to the point where this man went into a hysterical fit about it when I said no. And then he quit the church, undoubtedly putting curses on everybody because that was a secret agenda for him. And I wouldn't doubt that his Blue Lodge probably put him up to it. Travel to pagan countries, places, influences. My father used to tell me, don't ever bring any carved wooden objects or artwork from an underdeveloped country, no matter how much you like it or how little you paid for it. Because there's a good chance that these pieces have been dedicated to the Loas. Not only that, but in many depictions, people that are ignorant of such things, many depictions in sculpture or art projects in third world countries that are sold by natives are of pagan deities. You might notice in your own home, some of the knickknacks you have are made in foreign countries, like India. Some people like elephants a lot, made in India. You can almost bet that has been dedicated, or frogs. I like frogs and toads. but I don't want to put carved images of them in my house. When the man came to baptize me and my wife in the sacred name, I mentioned before that he went through the house and he took all kinds of stuff like that out. He said it was absolutely essential before we were baptized to get rid of that stuff and make sure that we not only fasted, but also went through kind of generic deliverance ministry. We find the same thing in the Nazarene Acts. I am getting so much insight from reading this out loud and recording the Nazarene Acts. It touches on so many spiritual and temporal issues, so many difficult questions, and things that are spiritually dark that we don't even realize are, because we don't know about them. And to go on with this just a little more, again, I put the book together and I did the work of translation from Latin 10 years ago or a little more. But I have no recollection of ever doing that. None. So I've read parts of the book here and there. But now going through it, I'm finding a tremendous urgency to get the teachings in that book out because of their primitive nature. Teachings, ways of doing things that are completely lost on the church and certainly lost on rabbinical roots type movements. When I get done, I'm going to go through it chapter by chapter if I actually get to it, and put some of these things down. This could be taught every week. Tremendous practical issues, like why is it that eating food dedicated to idols is wrong? Or why is it that you must fast for 3 days? Or why is it that some of the scriptures are wrong? Some of the scriptures are lies that have been put in. This especially in the homilies, the Appendix C of the Nazarene Acts. You're going to read a lot of things and a lot of things that are false and a lot of reasons why they are. That almost sounds blasphemous to say it. Pagan religions, influences. I'm going to say even food, even certain types of restaurants. Shocking events, like the lady that didn't sleep for a year and a half after going to a church Halloween party where they depicted people who said no to getting saved being dragged down into the pits of hell on stage. That puts something in people. Shocking events, sleeplessness, horrible dreams, cursed objects, stealing the ring from the head shop, a cursed ring. There used to be a television show on I liked called Friday the 13th, not that movie, but what this was about was a museum of cursed antiques. It was like a handbook of cursed objects and deliverance ministry. Do you remember that? It's in the early 90s, I think. Delighting in holidays. How many of us still long for the tinsel and the Christmas trees and the Easter egg hunts and the times that we had in the past that were happy and family oriented, especially for people who now are in the empty nest and really have nobody young close anymore. It's almost a type of seasonal affective disorder. Distant parent, I would imagine that 50 or more percent of us here had at least one distant parent. So always this craving to get approval from the distant parent. Why? Sometimes they don't care. But we all have run into people who are obsessed with a distant parent, and they will do anything to get attention, whether it's good or evil, just as long as they get the attention. That is demonic. Another one, a friend of mine who might be here tonight, I don't know. We're talking about prayer without consent. Somebody just coming up to you, no matter what environment you're in, and just start praying or laying hands on you. I know that passage, I think it's in Paul. It says, don't lay hands hastily. That has to do with ordination, of course, but it can have exactly the same to do with prayer. In fact, if you listen to one of the first Hearing Voices segments I did, it was an interview. This is how the person in the interview got demonized. They went into church to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and instead somebody came up and prayed for this person and imbued him with this talking spirit of self-hate, self-loathing, insults, and blasphemy. I don't like people to pray for me unless I ask them to. Poisoned associates, poisoned relatives, poisoned mates. In marriage counseling, I have probably suggested more people to get divorces than I did to work it out. Because one or the other or both were poisonous people that could either make each other miserable for decades to come, or get some help and go out discarding poisoned people and obtaining new associates that were encouraging and edifying. Genetic ties, of course, we inherit all kinds of tendencies. I used to say it was 90% nurture and 10% nature. I know when I was doing my bachelor's degree in abnormal psychology, this had switched. Since Watson and Crick came along, a much greater percentage, as much as 80%, some said at the time, of our diseases, our mental problems, our hindrances, our traits, personalities, temperaments were genetic in origin. I've heard that genetic ties can be broken. But I think this is something in the inner healing process that's too glossed over. It's not worked on enough. And I'm not talking about the minister doing the work. I'm talking about the person who's suffering doing the work. There's so many don't want to do anything. They want somebody else to do all this. In fact, in trying to help people in the past, it's hard to get people even to read a few pages. They want a quick fix. There is no quick fix for these things, but there is a fix. And what's the first step in any fix? Holiness. Torah, scriptural holiness. Womb trauma. I know a man whose mother had an abortion right before he was born. He was born like 9 months later. It wasn't until a deliverance session that that spirit of death was unmasked. And that womb trauma was solved through spiritual healing. And that solution cannot be exaggerated in its efficacy. Passive abortion, part of passive abortion is the hatred of the child. I have heard and read in the book Sociopath Next Door that some sociopathic, psychopathical people who get, I would talk about women who get pregnant, actually see that child as a hindrance to them getting what they want in the future. It's almost like using your mind to abort your body. Imaginary friend, not just children. An Abe Lincoln demon used to show up in my car when I took late night travels from school or church or back. As an adult in my 30s, it was so weird. The thing would ask questions. What's this? What's that? What's in this modern world? And I couldn't see it, but I could see it in the spirit, top hat and all. I got rid of that. Wretched work environment. You or somebody else, somebody you love, comes home from work, hates work, treated horrid at work, comes home and takes it out on you, or you take it out on them. Observing something aberrant. All right, if you are a prude or concerned about hearing something aberrant, put your finger in your ears. I have heard tell of people viewing some types of pornography that are so depraved that their mind was simply taken over, even though they were very much disattracted. It's hard for me to come up with words anymore. Even though they were horrified by it, when they got away from it, they found themselves desiring it and then re-experiencing it. One in particular is sex with animals, bestiality. One person I talked to, this was the problem. He knew it was absolutely evil. He just happened to see it. And then, after being horrified, he began to crave watching it. That's demonic. False tongues and false gifts. In one assembly I went to visit in Indiana, the pastor, who at that time was considered by a great majority of Christians as a cult leader, wish I could remember his name, you would know it. I was invited by a good friend of mine who, when we had prayer meetings, he prayed in tongues. It sounded like this. Da 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 da. That's what it sounded like. Now, was that praying in tongues? I thought, well, if you say so. Then I went to his church. And when they had this praise and worship event, what was everybody doing? Da 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 da. Everybody there was doing that. That's not speaking in tongues. False gifts. I was active in the ministry of interpretation. I can't tell you how many times I was in, for instance, full gospel businessmen meetings where somebody would give a legitimate message in tongues. And one of the bigwigs in the organization that came down from some other town every time gave the interpretation. It was like that was his job. But I felt in my spirit every time that it was false. A couple times I had it. And I would start, and then he would chime in, and I would feel horrible about it. Or when he was there, I just have to clam up. You clam up on a spiritual gift, a tongue to an assembly, or an interpretation, and you get a stream of guilt about 3 miles long that comes through you. Some of you know what I'm talking about. You feel that holy guilt. Whereas if you had just come forth with it in the first place, but again, public speaking is a very scary business. Outbursts of rage, they seem to come out of nowhere. They're triggered by the littlest things. Everybody has been a victim of this. However, we just consider it an outburst of rage. We don't consider what might be the root and cause of it. Some people can name their own root and cause. Some people can come up with the name of whatever that entity is that, when triggered, does the outburst. And sometimes that rage is not just an emotional puke and a walking away, it becomes violent. I pity people who are, out of a better word to use, hooked up with others with such things. Now we go to inside you, inside others, phobias, fears. Name your phobia. Everybody has them. Drive it out. You can condition yourself with phobias. Better if you have somebody to work with on it. Mind meddling and confusion. We talked about confusion, but mind meddling is the attempt to infiltrate somebody else's mind, often in the room, or to fantasize that somebody is watching you from afar, somebody that you're covetous of connecting with. It's almost like an astral projection, only you bring that person into the room to watch you. And then your behavior is on the lines of how you think that person would want to see you. Loss of identity. Who am I? What am I doing here? Why was I made, or why was I born? I wish I was never born. Born to raise hell. Self-loathing, rejection, unforgiveness. That's for you to get rid of that. I mean to say, forgive doesn't do the other person any good. But you got to get it off your chest before it becomes a gangrenous infection. Occultism, and so many different kinds, from as children playing Black Betty to being on Satan's altar, from one to the other, even the small things. Psychic friends are not your friends. They are your enemies. I was horrified to find that a relative of mine went and took her grown children every year and paid for their psychic readings. Horrified. Don't these people who have some knowledge in this area consider the possibility that whatever that witch is doing, it's not only going to go down the family line because of this, but even affect people who have nothing to do with it, like me? Snide or altered voice. I'm not talking about Brother Shroomkopf. But I have noticed on occasion that I'll make some remark that people are horrified about. I did this at a boot camp, and I had no remembrance of it whatsoever. In fact, when we talked about it, I said, there's no way I would say anything like that. Oh, you did, said multiple witnesses. Either it was a mass hallucination or it came out of me without my knowledge. Loss of time, loss of consciousness. One of the symptoms of DPD, multiple personality disorder. Where did the time go? I don't know what I did during those 5 hours. Hey, I don't know what I did during the months of rewriting the Clementine recognitions. I can remember none of it. Physical abuse, abuser, guilt, especially unfounded guilt. That's the hardest to get rid of. Idolatry, and I include fanism in that. Fanism. You're fans of celebrities. I try to read the news today. Half of it's about what a celebrity thinks about this or that. Or nowadays, like in Google News, it'll have a celebrity, especially these ones that are past their prime, like Cher and Bette Midler, and they'll have the caption of them saying something filthy about somebody respectable, as though that were news. But obviously, people thrive on such things. I think that goes for sports as well. Bishop Ragesh and I were talking about this the other day. There's an interest in sports, interest in other things, but there's fanism to fanaticism. And manipulation, putting people in situations where you get what you want. You know what I want? I want people to clearly see the condition of their souls. And I'll go to great lengths to the point where some say you're manipulative. Well, I don't take that as an insult if it's for the sake of the gospel, because I'm about the most frugal person you're ever going to meet. I have nothing. I want nothing except a couple things that my Father has given me and made known that are for me. Covetousness. Appropriating a demon when there's something you want. Emotionally opened or closed. Two ends of a spectrum. You can find out where you are on a very simple temperament assessment, about 12 questions. Open, you're open to anything. You're open to every doctrine that comes along. I found that people with the motivational gift of encouraging, according to Romans 12, if they were not dedicated to Torah, and most of them weren't, because most encouragers are like type 7 Enneagram, that they can be swayed by any wind of doctrine. And I heard today that one of our former Yahad people who does podcast was talking about the need for meditation, and that this person had started to take, what is the name of that dream journey drug where entities come to you and you're supposedly has something to do with the third eye? I never could pronounce it. But now this person is advocating this for meditation. And if you go online to YouTube and hear some of the testimonies of people that use this, one of the characteristics of it is that demonic entities in bodily form appear and engage you in conversation and other things. What is the name of that? Ayahuasca. There, I got it. Addictions of any kind, compulsions, I think I mentioned that. Porn, fantasy, dream life, desires, desire for money. That has to be cut off. If you do porn, you've got to cut it off. There's only one way you're going to be able to cut it off. Not usually through willpower. You're going to have to do it in a spiritual sense. You're going to have to come out against that demon. And listen, it will leave. Hypochondria, taking too much medicine. Old people are about forced to these days. I used to ask the people in the church to give me their list of their medications. And then I would go online and check with contradictory symptoms. And more than one time, I found fatal combinations of their drugs. Took the research to the person who took it to their doctor and raised heck with them. But that just tells me that the doctor is incompetent if they're doing that. Forbidden sexual experiences, as I mentioned before. Commandment breaking. Oh, but that's Old Testament. Jesus nailed it to the cross. Some people are going to have a rude awakening one of these days. Murder or mental murder. If you want to murder somebody, turn them over to the Father to murder. If it be your will, Father, I would like this person dead. This is controversial, but that way you get it off of you. You can ask forgiveness a lot of times. As Kenneth Hagin said, if you prayed 7 times, you prayed 6 times too many. If you want someone dead, quit fantasizing about it. Turn it over to the Father. If that person is worthless and destroying lives and is psychopathical, he'll take care of it, even if it means killing them. You should listen to a message on my site. It's by an old-time preacher back in the 50s. It's called God Kills People. Shocking, but scripturally sound. The problem is you have to get like the next one, obsession from that mental state. How do you pronounce that health guru's name? Weil. Is that Vile or Weil? Oh, he's the guy with the big beard and the bald head. Everybody's seen him. Andrew Weil. He wrote a book in '69 called The Natural Mind. It made news in the scientific community because at that time, Weil was a graduate scientist working in research. He came up with a theory that the human mind not only craved out of mind, out of body experiences, but that such were essential for mental health. I read that book in '69. And I read it again last year because he came out with a new edition. It's worth thinking about. It might be true. There's a scientific basis that he has, and he really had to kick against the pricks to bring that out at that time. Nevertheless, whether it is or not, one can become addicted and compulsive to such states. If you want to do something like that, go hear my teaching on lucid dreaming. You can do all that all you want because Yahweh will lead you in that. Bigotry, prejudice against, racism, sexism. I think it's worse bigotry now than it was during the Civil War. I told you, for me, one church I went into, I had to prove that I wasn't a Jew with a family tree and an oath because they were sure I was and they were going to get rid of me. And when the bishop came down, who happened to be an African American, they didn't recognize him. The ushers stopped him at the door saying, "Boy, we think you want that there church right down that road, don't you?" The bishop said, "Yeah, I guess that's what I want," and left. Wasn't good for those guys. Didn't know their bishop from the guy across the street because of their bigotry, especially African Americans, Jews. I have a problem too. I have a problem with Muslims. I know some. They're nice. I work with one. But this murderous agenda, this homosexual agenda, this political agenda, this socialist agenda, these things are starting to weigh heavy on my mind. And I'm glad that in our forum, we're talking more about what we can do about these things. Chronic depression. If you've got chronic depression, you can go online to any popular science, psychology kind of site and do an assessment and find out if you are. And playing the victim, I think we did that before. Our time's up, but let's go 10 more minutes. Cosmetics overload, both men and women. Tanning booth addiction. Tattoos, piercings, cuttings. I'm afraid if you get a tattoo, you're stuck with it. I would hope that it's benign. Piercings, cuttings are against Torah. What are we going to do about it now? When I growing up, the people with the tattoos were what my grandparents called town trash. I was scared of them. But I had an uncle that was town trash. So they said. He had tattoos on his arms. Born to raise hell, born to lose. One nipple was milk, the other was tea. Ridiculous things. And what a hellish life he had, even after he gave his life up to the Holy Spirit. I can't see what this green stuff on skin, how it can be attractive. I'm sorry if you have tattoos. I mean, we have, again, I have a teaching on tattoos. It's very positive, and what you can do about these, besides going to all the expense and pain of having them removed. I know one woman that converted. She had a death's head put on her buttock. No, I didn't see it, but she told me about it. She said, once I got converted, I got ashamed. And I went and paid all this money and I got a rose put over it. She said, this is a big tattoo, but the rose never looked right. Religious occult dabblings. I had a lucid dream this morning. Oh, two of them. One had to do with religious demons and being in the house of men and women with religious demons. It was not good, but it was very instructive. Sleepiness, sleeplessness. 15 years ago, there was a book that came out called The Sleeping Spirit. It's a good book. And alliances with sinners. You hook up in one way with another, with a sinner, you need to be on your guard. Business partners, even customers. You need to live the holy life. You need, if necessary, to do cleansing at the end of a day, even sprinkling. Oh, we just have one more paragraph. A view of others. Sudden outbursts, I think that comes under rage. Stealing, lying, covetous, jealousy, these are on the same par as using the name in vain, or murder, or Sabbath breaking. They're all in the Ten Commandments. Next time somebody says they keep commandments, just ask them what they are. Divorce, marital strife, strange bedfellow, infidelity. Divorce of a state marriage. It's a travesty that in order to be recognized in a marriage, you have to go and get a state license. Why? Because the people are reprobate who get married. They don't know what the purpose of marriage is. It's not to find happiness or to find a soulmate or love. The purpose of marriage is to serve your heavenly Father. That is the purpose, the main purpose. And of course, there are others. But in a state marriage, getting a divorce from that, when a couple doesn't get along, that will ruin your life. And even worse, it's having to live with that person for decades. That will ruin your life, your goals, your future in Yahweh, your ministry. Marital strife, strange bedfellow. You know, some people invite incubus and succubus in. You know that. Chronic sleepiness, yawning in religious activities. Oh, that's my sin. Especially in the Baptist church. I can't even stay awake. You know, I already know that drinking Bud Light will send you to hell. I've already been told that. I understand, but certainly there are some other things than that. Flat affect, dreaminess during waking hours. Flat affect is, it's a, I guess it's a mood that comes over a person where they really don't feel anything. People can't see any emotions in their face. They speak with a flat tone. And when they speak, they don't say much and they walk around pretty much like a zombie. This has to do with, again, brain chemistry, hormones, thyroid, or infiltration. The need for skin to skin, sexual addictions, dependence, mental disorders, diagnoses, perverse fantasies, power fantasies, slave master. Desiring to be a member of a clique, have a podcast on that. We did that, Allison, when we were in Virginia, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And here we're down to the end. This is a new one, but it is everywhere. Supporting obvious hoaxes, which is tantamount to me to lying, breaking the commandment. Money schemes, social media in some respects, though social media, I believe, is the greatest evangelism opportunity we have ever had. And we end up where we started with panic attacks. Are you able to receive the names of the entities within or without? I told you that some people actually know the names of these things. That's a good question to ask. And of course, what we want to do is confessions. But one thing that's always left out when believers do confessions, and that is the absolutions. You have the power to forgive sins. It's one thing for the Almighty Father to forgive sins, but what good does it do you? He already knows everything you're going to do. How can you disappoint him? But if you have a confessor or somebody confesses to you, it is very important to, in the name of Yeshua, absolve them. In fact, it's worth looking up a prayer there if you can't think of one. Absolve them from their sins or iniquities. The difference between sins and iniquities is iniquities are inborn. Sins are tendency to sin. Sin is just the outright doing of something. So when you read your prophets, you can make a distinction between the two and it's meaningful. All right, that finishes it up at 11 o'clock. Now let me ask you, I don't know if there's any chat, doesn't look like it. Is anybody still there?
Yep.
All right, so we have talked about doing some role playing, and Alice and I are going to do it. We're not quite ready yet.
Yeah.
But we will be soon. I think we need to talk about dreams and visions too. I'm sorry about Wednesday, and I'm sorry about not putting the right day up for this. I have a hindrance right now that I'm dealing with. Don't pray for me. It's something I have to work out. It's not a sin, but it causes me to be very, very fatigued at times where I cannot do anything. It might be a curse. It just might be my condition. Yes. Thank you, Kay. That's a big load off my mind. Amen. Anybody? All right.
Oh, I have one question.
Go ahead.
Can you dig up a little more about the genetic ties and how to break that?
Oh, yeah, I can.
That'd be great.
Sure.
I've never heard of that.
Sure. It might be original. Maybe some of the others, it was kind of thrown in with soul ties, but you see, in the days where people were doing a lot of inner healing, they were the same days where they thought nurture was nearly 100% of what made you what you are. But since that time, 20 years ago and before, it's coming around again to genetics as being, or morphic fields.
True. Good point.
Yes, morphic fields explains a lot of stuff like that. I'm
Yeah.
glad you reminded me. Yes, I'll look into that. And I
Thank
thank you for coming.
Thanks.
Yah be with you all. Love you.